Dearest of friends, welcome back to the Letchingston Museum and Art Gallery for what shall be a very special private view event this evening. As many of you will know, this season we are celebrating 100 years of being a radical and progressive space for the liberal arts. Something which would not be at all possible without support from you, our platinum members, including Oil Limited and Budget Ballistics, as well as through the support of the endowment of our esteemed founder, Sir Lawrence Slave Trader Colonialism. However, as of late, we have found ourselves on something of the wrong end of a demographic shift. Our hearts, of course, remain with the family of the couple who unfortunately passed away seemingly just from old age whilst viewing the pottery exhibits just last month. And so, I'm very proud to announce that the Letchingston Museum and Art Gallery shall, from this evening forth, be known as the Dat Boi International Art Forum. That's right, out go the portraits and porcelain, and in come the memes, the hashtags, the likes. I'm sure you'll find it absolutely poggers. So, if you'd like to begin your tour by heading through the Crazy Frog Memorial Wing, all that remains is for me to wish you the dankest of times. On the 4th of January 2008, the user Jarry N. Kell added a new entry to the crowdsourced online glossary Urban Dictionary. The entry defined the term shitpost as a verb, referring to the act of making utterly worthless and inane posts on an internet message board. Early instances of the term being used, such as those archived on the website Know Your Meme, seem to have been primarily derogatory. To suggest that a user, or an entire community perhaps, was shitposting in the mid-2000s was to accuse them of being unfunny, uninteresting, or both. Over the following years, however, the meaning of the term gradually evolved. If, previously, shitposting was something that one accused someone else of doing, increasingly individuals and communities began to use it to describe their own online activity. Furthermore, where one's contributions being described as shitposts might have initially been seen as a source of shame, the label began to be worn with pride. Eventually, shitposting was not something that one did accidentally by being a bit dull when one was hoping to be interesting or by posting a joke which didn't quite land, but something that one did intentionally. Fast forward to the present day, and posting bad, meaningless, or otherwise shit content has become perhaps the favourite pastime of the extremely online. To be seen to be putting effort into crafting one's offerings to online spaces is considered, at best, a bit naive, and at worst, outright irritating. If the English-speaking internet, as experienced by anyone under the age of 40, has a patron saint, it is perhaps Drill, whose angry, crude, and yet mostly inane Twitter posts are largely entertaining because of the fact the author seems to have put so little effort into trying to make them so. Drill's tweets might be read as a kind of parody, but if that's the case, then the reason they connect with so many people is because they are the perfect encapsulation of an internet culture in which a non-committal ambivalence has become the norm. Yet, is shitposting really driven merely by ambivalence, or is there something more to it? In today's video, we're going to look at shitposting as a kind of art form. We're going to draw upon some historical precedents to shitposting from both music and the visual arts to try and break down exactly how shitposting works and what its appeal is. Furthermore, we're going to examine shitposting's relationship to the more sincere forms of online discourse which exist around it, to ask what it might be about our society, and the internet more specifically in the contemporary moment, that has caused this anarchic form to flourish. Before we turn our attention to some historical precursors to shitposting, I want to spend just a moment longer on definitions. We've already noted how popular understandings of the term shitpost shifted from early uses as a derogatory epithet to a term that one might use to proudly describe their own online contributions. Whilst the notion that shitposting is something that one does intentionally is now relatively settled, however, in the present day there remain two competing uses of the term which differ slightly in their assessment of what that intent is. The first I'm going to refer to as aimless shitposting. This is perhaps shitposting at its purest. As Tom Wyman explains, in this understanding of the term, the shitpost is defined by a sort of indifference, both to quality and reception, both positive and negative. Used in this way, to shitpost is to post seemingly for the sake of posting, with zero regard for what, if any, response one's posts will elicit. It's under this category that we might file the work of Drill, the weird drawings of Chris, Simpson's artist, and much of the output of 4chan and its various offshoots. In truth, we might question whether those who engage in this kind of shitposting are genuinely completely disinterested in how their posts are received. In most instances, I would suggest that at least some thought has gone into whether a post will provoke laughter, anger, or some other response. Yet, at the very least, this mode of shitposting celebrates the appearance of a lack of care and effort. The most important attribute of this form of shitposting, however, is the relationship, or lack thereof, between the individual shitpost and the other posts on the board, forum, group, community, or site that they're submitted to. For, on a purely aesthetic level, it can often be hard to distinguish shitposts from other forms of online contribution. Nick Douglas has argued that what he calls internet ugly, a visual mode which, as in Chris Simpson's artist's work, celebrates the sloppy and amateurish, has become a core aesthetic of the internet. Douglas suggests that this aesthetic has long been present in countless meme formats, including the badly drawn faces of rage comics and the sloppy photoshopping of early versions of advice animals. What distinguishes the aimless shitpost from the meme, then, is a general lack of interest in how one's post relates to those that have preceded it. In polite conversation, whether online or off, one generally tries to ensure that one's contributions build upon those that have been made before. Memes work similarly, gradually incorporating new ideas into a tried and tested format. Aimless shitposting, by contrast, celebrates the unexpected and the disconnected, the interruption and the obstruction. This brings us neatly on to the second form of shitposting, which I'm going to refer to as disruptive shitposting. As I mentioned a moment ago, all shitposting is in some way predicated on disruption. Nevertheless, in shitposting communities built around aimless shitposting, this disruption tends to be relatively playful. The introduction of seemingly random new ideas with little relation to that which has gone before being akin to a game in which the shitposter challenges the community to find some kind of meaning or humour in their senseless contributions. By disruptive shitposting, I mean the use of shitposting by one community to disrupt the conversations of another. In this understanding of the term, writes Sean McEwen, shitposting derails active discussion and sends threads off topic through low quality posting, often using inflammatory, ironically falsifiable, provocative or vulgar content. If aimless shitposting might be seen as a game played within a consenting community, disruptive shitposting is a weapon which is turned by one community on another. Now, there's a great deal of crossover between these two modes of shitposting, and we're going to examine both in the course of this video. A core part of my argument, in fact, is that both are responses to similar evolutions in online spaces over the past decade or so. Not least its professionalisation and gradual annexation by corporations and legacy media outlets. I want to start, however, by focusing on what I've called aimless shitposting, to consider what we might learn about how shitposting works through viewing it not merely as a dumb, immature activity, but as an art form. Hi everyone, I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Protect yourself online by heading to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas and using the code TomNicholas to get 84% off a 2-year plan and an extra 4 months for free, meaning that your subscription will cost just $2.13 a month. Surfshark helps to protect your privacy online by essentially creating a private internet connection which stops both trackers on websites that you visit and your own internet service provider from snooping on your online activity. Surfshark's clean web mode will even block out ads to make your browsing experience infinitely more pleasurable. Best of all, unlike other VPN services, Surfshark allows you to install their app on as many devices as you like, meaning that you can have it on multiple computers, your phone, a tablet, to ensure that you're protected, safe, and anonymous wherever, whenever, and however you choose to go online. Now that lockdown's over here in the UK, I'm really looking forward to getting out and doing some of my research, my reading and my writing in cafes and in libraries, and not just in these 4 walls. Using Surfshark gives me that added peace of mind that I'm not going to be hacked or tracked whilst using public Wi-Fi, which can be a little bit dodgy. So if you want to take advantage of that incredible time-limited deal of 84% off a 2-year plan and an added 4 months for free, you can support the channel by letting them know that I sent you through heading over to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas and using the code TomNicholas. Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring to today's video. Now, on with the show. In some regards, shitposting could only have emerged on the internet. Whilst most of the examples I've drawn upon so far have been of individual shitposters whose posts have secured them some level of notoriety, at its core, it's an inherently participatory form. Nevertheless, there are a handful of historical predecessors to shitposting in the artistic sphere, which I think can help us to get a better sense of what the appeal of shitposting is and how it relates to the more sincere forms of discourse which surround it. In a 2020 article for the Australian youth culture magazine, Happy, Matt Brazel points to several precursors to shitposting in classical music. One example he forwards is Mozart's 1787 composition, A Musical Joke, which, according to Brazel, broke every possible rule of 18th century composition. It employed scales and harmonic techniques that were largely foreign to the classical era. The musicologist, Irving Gott, makes the case for viewing A Musical Joke as a kind of 18th century shitpost even stronger, when he suggests that, judged against the relatively strict compositional conventions of that era, the piece displays such monumental incompetence that I question whether we dare hope ever to catalogue completely all of its diverse faux pas. Mozart never provided any indication as to why he decided to compose this piece. However, we know he had a strong and often quite juvenile sense of humour. And given how accomplished the rest of his work is, we have to assume that all these supposed flaws were an intentional attempt to confuse and perhaps ridicule the piece's eventual audience. Brazel foregrounds a slightly more recent example of musical shitposting in the experimental composer John Cage's 1952 piece 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The score for the piece declares that it can be performed by any instrument or combination of instruments. The twist being that it never requires the musicians holding those instruments to play a single note. The composition consists of 3 movements, or sections, in which the performers simply sit or stand in absolute silence. Brazel writes that Cage's music challenged the social etiquette of modern concerts and exploited the audience's heightened anticipation in the setting of a prestigious concert hall. If, in Mozart's competition, an audience sits down expecting to listen to something beautiful and is presented instead with something which breaks all of the established rules of composition, in Cage's work they are presented with nothing at all. To point to one further example, in a 2018 article for Polygon, Sam Greases similarly searches for predecessors to shitposting in the visual arts. He primarily highlights the work of Marcel Duchamp, who, in 1917, anonymously submitted a new artwork to the inaugural exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists, a then recently formed group of avant-garde artists working in the United States. The piece was titled Fountain and consisted of a porcelain urinal laying on its back and signed R. Mutt. Despite the explicit purpose of the exhibition being to showcase innovative work with an open curation process, the manner in which Fountain so completely upturned commonly held ideas of what counts as art led the organisers to hide the piece from view during the exhibition. We'll explore the initial intent of each of these artists more thoroughly shortly. Yet, I want to begin, perhaps counterintuitively, by acknowledging the fact that, viewed from the present day, none of these pieces feel like shitposts. Musicologists might attempt to convince us that Mozart's A Musical Joke is deeply transgressive, but to my untrained ear, it just sounds like bog-standard classical music. Watching videos of performances of Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, one doesn't see an audience beset with confusion or shock when the musicians don't play their instruments, but instead one which slowly nods with an affected sincerity and understanding. Finally, where Duchamp's Fountain was once hidden from view, an authorised replica of the piece now sits in London's Tate Modern, one of the most revered art galleries in the world. Whilst these pieces may once have seemed provocative, ridiculous, or nonsensical, they've since come to be seen as canonical works, as vitally important pieces in the histories of their respective art forms. This can provide us with considerable insight into what I've called aimless shitposting. For whilst most shitposts languish, die, and are forgotten about fairly quickly, it's important to recognise the regularity with which a select few come to be embraced by certain online communities and injected with layer upon layer of meaning. A good example of this might be Simpsonwave, a genre of music which gained popularity through forums such as the Facebook group Simpsons Shitposting in 2016. Simpsonwave combines the floated, distorted sound of vaporwave with similarly distorted footage from The Simpsons. The genre appears to have grown from a series of what were little more than shitposts. Yet many found these dreamlike creations captivating, and Simpsonwave soon developed a sincere following. Perhaps the definitive example of the genre, Lucian Hugh's Sunday School, has amassed over 16 million views on YouTube. Another example of this phenomenon might be Drill's 2011 tweet, in which he writes, "I'm not owned, I'm not owned. I continue to insist as I slowly shrink and transform into a corn cob." The tweet itself is fairly nonsensical. Nevertheless, it was embraced by the denizens of so-called weird Twitter as a kind of undirected parody of people who, on having clearly lost an online argument, continue to insist that they won. So routinely is the tweet posted in the replies of people unwilling to admit defeat that the term corn-cobbed, which Amelia Tate suggests refers to being owned while angrily and vehemently denying that you were owned at all, has passed into common parlance in certain corners of the web. In the previous section, I suggested that we could view aimless shitposting as a kind of game, in which the shitposter challenges a consenting community to find meaning in what are initially senseless posts. And whether this is the explicit intent of the poster or not, what we see is that posts which begin life as shitposts routinely develop a life of their own, and, like A Musical Joke, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and Fountain, come to be invested with significance. Before we turn our attention to what the initial intentions of Mozart, Cage, and Duchamp might have been, and what this can reveal about disruptive shitposting, I want to continue to focus on the manner in which some shitposts shed their shittiness and become endowed with meaning in order to consider how shitposting works to build, strengthen, and defend online communities. We might assume that it is the initial randomness and senselessness of shitposting which is its core appeal, with any later development of a shitpost into something resembling an identifiable and replicable meme being a largely unwanted byproduct. Sean McEwen, however, has argued that it is the tension between a lack of meaning in the initial shitpost and the later attachment of meaning to it which enable such strong communities to develop around this seemingly inane practice. McEwen writes that, far from being random, shitposting functions to accrue cultural capital, a form of social standing within a particular environment defined by knowledge and recognition of cultural artifacts and the ability to place them within hierarchy. In his use of the term cultural capital here, McEwen is drawing on the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu was interested in how different social classes come to manifest not only as economically distinct from one another, but also socially and culturally distinct too. Why is it, for example, that a working class person who wins the lottery and buys a fancy house might find it difficult to fit in amongst their new, affluent neighbours? Bourdieu suggested that one reason is that, whilst the lottery winner might now have a similar amount of economic capital as their wealthy neighbours, they will still be lacking in cultural capital. A phrase which he defines as referring to a familiarity with the culture of the dominant class and a mastery of the signs and emblems of distinction and taste. To simplify it wildly, Bourdieu suggested that knowingly or otherwise, economic elites used their shared knowledge of so-called legitimate cultural forms such as literature, opera and portraiture, say, as a kind of defence mechanism, to ensure that it is always possible to tell who is a true member of the elite with the requisite upbringing and education to match, and who is an imposter. Several scholars have applied this concept to online communities, noting the manner in which online groups and forums come to develop shared cultures, which can seem outright baffling to those who aren't a part of them. In 2015, for example, Asaf Nissenbaum and Limor Schiffman undertook a study of 4chan's B board, concluding that status is important to B users, and cultural capital is a major factor in signifying this status. Displaying knowledge of the board's customs and codes is a predominant form of capital used to determine status. They highlighted how, even on a site to which users post anonymously, the complexities of the board's culture allows B regulars to distinguish relatively easily between insiders and outsiders. Outsiders have a habit of using meme templates wrongly, making jokes which are considered to have grown stale, and misusing or misunderstanding the board's subcultural slang. Whilst aimless shitposting on boards such as B, in groups such as Simpsons Shitposting, or within Twitter subcultures such as Weird Twitter, might ostensibly be about celebrating the ephemeral, the random and the nonsensical, then the ascendancy of a select few shitposts into the shared cultural consciousness of that community, and the development of shared attributes among the posts that are submitted, is essential to the formation and continuation of these communities. It is the existence of a shared canon of respected posts from the past, and what Nissenbaum and Schiffman referred to as the shared codes and customs of a community, which allow users to both identify other members of that community and to detect interlopers. The constant submission of new, seemingly random posts, however, remains of vital importance. For whilst the development of a shared culture is essential to sustaining any online community, it also poses a threat to that community's distinctiveness. For one, as in the example of Simpsonwave and Drill's corncob tweet, an idea which began life as a shitpost within a specific community might develop into an identifiable and replicable meme which flourishes outside of it. Should a post, format or idea gain traction on the mainstream internet in this way, it is no longer possible for members of the originating community to use a knowledge of it to distinguish insider from outsider. Furthermore, the more repetitive the culture of a community grows, the easier it becomes for newcomers to master. And the easier it becomes for outsiders to become insiders, the less cohesive the community will begin to appear. To return to the artworks discussed a moment ago, we might posit that this is one reason that pieces such as Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds and Duchamp's Fountain, once seen as disrespecting the norms and conventions of their respective art forms, have since come to be celebrated by economic and cultural elites. For should the legitimate culture of the elite ever become too easy to comprehend, it would lose its power as a means of identifying working class imposters. These works have thus served to add an additional complexity to elite culture, which continues to make it difficult for outsiders to gain the knowledge required to break in. Within shitposting communities, the constant submission of new posts, which initially seem entirely inane, serves a similar purpose. The shitposts themselves not only ensure that a community's shared culture doesn't grow stale, but also ensures that it remains difficult for outsiders to understand, thus defending the community's distinctiveness from the rest of the internet. Whilst we might often assume that aimless shitposting is only about the randomness of the posts that are submitted then, the comparison with historical precedents from music and the visual arts suggests that the appeal of aimless shitposting actually lies in the tension between randomness and recognition. And I wonder whether we might view the rise of this particular mode of online community formation as a response to the gradual mainstreaming of the internet as a cultural forum. In 1997, David Porter wrote of the unique culture of the internet. And for some time, it was entirely possible to view internet culture as a distinct cultural entity. Gradually, however, the online and offline worlds have melded in a manner which has led to a breakdown of the cohesiveness of the internet as a cultural and social space. I think we can view aimless shitposting then as, at least on some level, being driven by a desire to make the internet weird again. To use posts which, to the outsider, appear completely senseless to defend at least a few small corners of online space from the creeping professionalization and normalization of the web. Of course, there are not always valiant intentions behind these desires. Whitney Phillips recalls that the culture of the early internet often aligned with and reproduced the norms of whiteness, maleness, middle-classness, and the various tech geek interests stereotypically associated with middle-class white dudes. The long-standing connection between aimless shitposting and far-right content, particularly on 4chan, might be read as an attempt to use shitposting as a means to allow such a scenario to continue, at least in some online communities. Nevertheless, I don't think the desire for a cohesive community has to be reactionary. Whatever the shared interests of a particular group, and whether or not the users are actually old enough to remember those early days of the internet, I think we can identify in aimless shitposting a desire to build and defend communities which retain the internet's association with the cultural fringes. The manner in which elites have embraced works such as 4 minutes and 33 seconds and Fountain as a means of class distinction may have proven useful to our discussion of how aimless shitposting helps to distinguish online communities from the mainstream internet. Nevertheless, this absorption into the legitimate culture was far from the intention of Duchamp or Cage. In the following section then, I want to return to those artworks in order to consider what the similarities between the circumstances in which they were conceived and the present day might have to tell us about the appeal and function of disruptive shitposting. In his article on shitposting in classical music, Matt Brazel acknowledges that, in the present day, John Cage's work is often viewed as deliberately inaccessible and pretentious. As I mentioned a moment ago, watching videos of performances of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, one generally doesn't see audiences beset with shock and confusion, but instead spectators slowly nodding with an affected sincerity, seemingly keen to show others in the audience that they are engaging with the work with the appropriate amount of reverence. Cage's hopes for the composition were not entirely unserious. In a talk given in 1957, he described the experience of standing in an anechoic chamber, a room designed to achieve a state as near to silence as possible. He recalled that, stood in the room, I heard 2 sounds, one high and one low. When I described them to the engineer in charge, he informed me that the high one was my nervous system in operation, the low one my blood in circulation. Until I die, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death. On one level, 4 minutes and 33 seconds invites the listener to similarly reckon with the fact that they will never experience true silence. Nevertheless, Brazel also connects Cage's compositional work to his political outlook. Cage described himself as an anarchist, and, writes Brazel, there's a layer of irony in Cage's work, and he found joy in treating serious domains with a tongue-in-cheek irreverence. Whilst we've so far largely considered 4 minutes 33 seconds as a precursor to aimless shitposting then, it can also be viewed as an example of disruptive shitposting. An attempt to parody the pretensions of the very same elite culture which now claims this work as their own. It is the work of Duchamp, however, which most clearly resembles what I've been referring to as disruptive shitposting. As Sam Griesers highlights in the article discussed earlier, Duchamp was part of an artistic movement known as Dada. David Hopkins writes that Dada was an international artistic phenomenon which sought to overturn traditional bourgeois notions of art. It was often defiantly anti-art. More than anything, its participants counterposed their love of paradox and effrontery to the insanities of a world gone mad. The movement was born amid the tumult of the First World War, the bloodiest conflict in history, in which 9 million, mostly conscripted soldiers, and 13 million civilians died for reasons that seemed as vague at the time as they do now. The Dadaists proposed that a world in which such slaughter was taking place was not one which called for, or deserved, the decadent, picturesque beauty which had characterised the art of the previous century. As they saw it, the only logical artistic response to such a world was to create art which defied logic entirely. Griesers suggests that Dada was fuelled by a cultural rage, and the Dadaists attacked and ridiculed the existing artistic canon in several ways. In 1919, Duchamp drew a goatee on a postcard featuring the Mona Lisa, adding the caption LHOOQ, which, when read in French, sounds a bit like the phrase, "she is hot in the arse." In doing so, Duchamp, like Cage, mocked the pretensions of an art world which tended, and often still tends, to take itself very seriously indeed. Fountain, however, goes one step further, questioning what it is that makes something art in the first place. Is it something essential about the object itself? Is it the ideas which informed the creation of that object? Or is it simply its placement within the context of a gallery and the fact that we are told that it is art? While Duchamp's work may have since become part of the artistic canon of the cultural elite then, at origin it was an attack on that very sphere. Duchamp and the other Dadaists engaged moronic humour to question how well pre-existing bourgeois art served the world around it. I think such work can provide a useful insight into what I call disruptive shitposting in the present day. Disruptive shitposting first came to mainstream attention during the 2016 US presidential election. In September of that year, Palmer Luckey, the designer of the Oculus Rift VR headset, founded a non-profit organisation called Nimble America, writing on the now-banned subreddit The Donald that "We've proven that shitposting is powerful and meme magic is real. So many of you have asked us, how can we bring this to real life?" This followed a broader trend in which communities such as The Donald and 4chan began to move beyond aimless shitposting within their own communities and to disseminate their creations across the internet. This mostly consisted of spreading memes which drew attention to various scandals, both real and concocted, relating to Hillary Clinton. It's hard to gauge the extent to which these posts were inspired by a genuine enthusiasm about a Donald Trump presidency, or simply by the manner in which Trump's ripping up of the accepted norms of representative politics seems to echo the anarchic ethos of the shitposters themselves. Either way, a great deal of attention has already been diverted to what Rodney Taviera and Emma Balfour refer to in an article for The Conversation as the 2016 meme war. The manner in which discussions of shitposting return time and time again to this particular period often gives the impression that disruptive shitposting is a definitively right-wing phenomenon. Yet, I don't think this is the case. As Andrew Griffin writes, shitposting in itself doesn't appear to have much of a politics, instead being a tool that can be put to a variety of effects, being used by everyone from the far right, such as Trump fans, to left-wing groups online like those meant to support Bernie Sanders. In the penultimate section of this video then, I want to focus on an instance of disruptive shitposting that occurred during the 2019 general election in order to consider what our understanding of Dada might tell us about the function of shitposting across the political divide in the present day. First, some background. The year is 2019 and the United Kingdom is in the midst of a general election. On the right, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party are campaigning under the slogan "Get Brexit Done", seeking a further mandate to complete Britain's exit from the European Union. On the left, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party are campaigning for a green industrial revolution and to take public services back into public ownership. Attempting to run through their middle are the Liberal Democrats and their newly elected leader, Joe Swinson. Despite the party having won just 7.4% of the vote and 12 of a possible 650 parliamentary seats of the previous election, Swinson was confident, telling the crowd at the party's campaign launch that she was a candidate to be Prime Minister. Then, scandal broke. On the 2nd of November, a since-deleted Twitter account with the handle GroovyGuyZone tweeted a fabricated screenshot of a fictitious news story made to look as though it had been posted on the website of the tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mirror. The image had the headline, "Joe Swinson blasted by animal rights charities after harrowing footage found on private Facebook," continuing that this footage showed Swinson loading a slingshot with pebbles and firing them at squirrels in her garden. Again, the story was entirely fictional, but it began to spread on both Twitter and Facebook. 2 weeks later, Swinson was being forced to confront the story head-on during an interview on the radio station LBC. Of course, it wasn't hard for Swinson to shake off this story, and one would hope that most people have the critical skills to see it for what it was, a relatively dumb joke. Yet, as we've already acknowledged, the goal of disruptive shitposting is not necessarily to get people to believe the often ridiculous assertions contained within a post, but instead to more broadly derail the discourse. And one could hardly imagine a greater success for a disruptive shitposter than a politician being unable to pitch their policy platform because they're too busy reassuring the electorate that they don't, in fact, murder squirrels for fun. Now, we don't know what the intentions of the person behind this post were. We don't know what their political beliefs are. All we have to go on is the fact that they seem not to have been the biggest fan of Joe Swinson. Yet, I think the echoes of Dada that we can identify in disruptive shitposting are instructive. In his article, Sam Griesses draws attention to several commonalities between the years in which the Dadaists were active and the present day. A spike in nationalism, acceleration in the growth of the wage gap, as well as wage stagnation, and a growing population of young people frustrated by their surroundings. I think the hopelessness that the intersecting economic, ecological, and political crises the world is presently facing are almost certainly a contributing factor to the rise of both disruptive and aimless shitposting. Just as Duchamp and his peers felt that, as Griesses puts it, a shitty world deserves shitty art, there's likely an extent to which shitposting is driven by the sentiment that a shitty world deserves shitty posts. Nevertheless, I think there are more internet-specific reasons that shitposting has been embraced in the way that it has. See, in the early days of the World Wide Web, many believed that this new technology was going to fundamentally reshape human society. This cyber-utopianism found its clearest voice in the pages of Wired magazine, and is thus sometimes referred to as the Wired ideology. As Ben Lear writes, this ideology saw a potential emancipation of humanity via the new technologies and potentials of the internet. The belief was that the connections the internet enabled would provide a voice to the previously voiceless and allow a more decentralized society to emerge. The internet has, of course, changed the world in which we live in many ways. It has even, on occasion, played a role in emancipatory movements. Although this assessment has since been questioned, during the Arab Spring in 2010, journalists put considerable emphasis on the role of social media in allowing activists to coordinate. Technologies such as social media, peer-to-peer encrypted messaging, and the ability to easily and cheaply publish ideas online have likely bolstered countless social and political movements. Nevertheless, with regard to the broader distribution of power in society, little has changed. As Evgeny Morozov tweeted in 2017, 1990s tech utopianism posited that networks weaken or replace hierarchies. In reality, networks amplify hierarchies and make them less visible. The most relevant aspect of this re-establishment of old hierarchies in the new online world to our discussion relates to the media. The internet has certainly birthed countless new media platforms which give voice to perspectives which would have been unlikely to have been platformed by their print or television predecessors. Nevertheless, the most visited news websites remain those of what some optimistically refer to as legacy media. CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, the Guardian. More broadly, Gert Lovink has written that mainstream media's role as clearinghouses for facts and opinions has been undermined for decades by growing centripetal forces in society that no longer accept particular baby boom sentiments such as truth and independence. Yet, while their legitimacy has faded, their influence remains substantial. Some alternative outlets may have risen, yet for better or for worse, it is largely the same, sometimes century-old outlets that are seen as the final arbiters of truth. I think we can therefore view disruptive shitposting as a response to this growing realization that the internet is likely to do little to upturn pre-existing hierarchies. Where a more optimistic internet might have continued to birth new media enterprises, the acknowledgement that these might be doomed to have only marginal influence has led to the emergence of a form of discursive engagement which, at least in cases such as Joe Swinson's Squirrel controversy, is content to use the limited amount of participation in the public sphere that social media technologies allow to at least disrupt the prevailing discourse. The notion seems to be that if we can't have our media, we're going to at least do our best to confound yours. As Cordelia Jenkins has written, after all, if you see public discourse as a sewer, the logical response might be to flood its channels with excrement. So to conclude, shitposting in both its aimless and disruptive forms often seems to be driven merely by ambivalence. Many of those who practice it would likely resist it being labelled anything more than this. Nevertheless, viewing contemporary shitposting in relation to some of its predecessors from music and the visual arts suggests that there might be something more going on here. As I've argued, I think we can view both aimless and disruptive shitposting as responses to connected evolutions of the internet as a social and cultural forum. Whether a response to the creeping mainstream of the internet or to its annexation by corporations and legacy media outlets, shitposting seems to have emerged as a reaction to a waning cyber-optimism and a growing pessimism about what the consequences of these still relatively new technologies might be. Perhaps there may still come a time when the internet is yet again viewed as a place of possibilities. But until then, maybe shitposting is a more logical mode of online engagement than even its most enthusiastic proponents might give it credit for. If you've made it this far, then thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting in some way, and if you have, then I'd be hugely grateful if you'd consider sharing it with any friends, either online or off, that you think might also get something out of it. Thank you, as ever, to Michael V. Brown, J. Fraser Cartwright, Richard, Kaya Lau, David Brothers, Chris Brown, Paul Arrowsmith, Max DeVos, Alan Gann, Daniela Menchaca, Cincione Bresgal, Luke Meyer, Gary, Dylan Gordon, Dickon Spain, Jimmy Johnstonson, Greg Miller and Gabrielle Wills for being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon. If you'd like to join them in supporting what I do here, whilst also getting early access to my videos, copies of the scripts to them, exclusive commentary videos and more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again and have a great week.